My dear brothers and sisters, my beloved friends, sit with me for a moment, and let us talk about something that every single human being on the face of this earth is searching for, whether they know it or not. Every person you have ever met, every stranger who passed you on the street today, every soul who has ever lived and breathed under the sky, they are all searching for one thing. They are searching for truth. Some search for it in wealth, and when they find the wealth, they discover it was not truth. Some search for it in status, in fame, in the applause of other people, and when they climb that mountain and reach the top, they look around and they realize the view is empty because that was not truth either. Some search for it in pleasure, in comfort, in the fleeting joys of this world, and truth slips through their fingers like sand, because pleasure was never truth to begin with. And so people spend their entire lives running after shadows, chasing reflections in the water, exhausting themselves, until one day, if they are fortunate, if Allah has mercy on them, they stop running and they ask the only question that actually matters. What is real? What is actually, truly, eternally real? This is the question that a man born over 900 years ago in the town of Naif, in the region of Gilan in Persia, dedicated his entire life to answering. His name was Abdul Qadir Jilani, and history remembers him as Ghawth al-Azam, the greatest helper, Sultan al-Awliya, the king of the saints. But before he was given these grand titles, he was simply a young man with a burning question in his heart, a question that would not let him sleep, a question that pulled him away from the comfort of his home and sent him walking, on foot, across deserts and mountains, to the city of Baghdad, in search of knowledge, in search of guidance, in search of truth. And what he discovered on that journey, and what he taught for the rest of his life to thousands upon thousands of students who gathered around him, is something so profound, so structured, so beautifully organized, that it has guided seekers of truth for nearly 1,000 years. And tonight, I want to walk through that teaching with you, step by step, because I believe with all my heart that if you understand this, if you truly absorb this, it will change the way you see your entire life. Abdul Qadir Jilani taught that truth is not a single door that you walk through and suddenly you have arrived. No. Truth is a journey. It is a path with stages, with levels, with a beginning and a middle and a destination. And he described this journey in 4 great levels. The first is Shariah, the second is Tariqa, the third is Marifa, and the fourth is Haqiqa, 4 words, 4 levels, 4 stages of a single journey toward the same ultimate reality. And I want you to imagine, as we go through this together tonight, that we are not just listening to abstract philosophy. We are talking about the architecture of your own soul. We are talking about the roadmap that has been laid out for every single one of us, whether we have ever heard these 4 words before or not. Let me give you an image that the great masters of this path have used for centuries, an image that will help this settle into your heart before we even begin to unpack the details. Think of an almond, a single almond, sitting in your hand. That almond has a hard outer shell. Underneath that shell there is a thin skin. Underneath that skin there is the kernel, the meat of the almond itself. And within that kernel, if you press it, if you extract it, there is oil. Pure oil, the very essence of what that almond was created to produce. 4 layers: shell, skin, kernel, oil. And this is exactly how Abdul Qadir Jilani described the journey of the human soul toward God. Sharia is the shell, it is the outer protection, the law, the structure that holds everything else together and keeps it safe. Tariqa is the skin, the path you walk once you have cracked open that shell, the discipline that refines you. Marifa is the kernel, the direct knowledge, the taste, the substance of spiritual reality. And Haqiqa is the oil, the pure essence, the ultimate truth that was always there, hidden inside, waiting to be extracted. Now, here is something critically important that I need you to understand before we go any further, because this is where so many people throughout history have gone terribly wrong. You cannot get to the oil without going through the shell. You cannot skip steps. You cannot say, I am too advanced for the law. I have moved beyond religious obligation. I have reached a higher truth, so the rules no longer apply to me. Abdul Qadir Jilani warned against this more forcefully, more repeatedly, more passionately than almost any other teaching in his entire life's work. He saw people in his own time, people claiming spiritual heights, claiming secret knowledge, claiming closeness to God, while abandoning their prayers, while ignoring what is lawful and unlawful, while living however they pleased and calling it freedom, calling it enlightenment. And he called this out directly. He said, this is not the path. This is deception. This is the whisper of the ego dressed up in spiritual clothing. Because the shell protects the kernel. Without the shell, there is no kernel to protect. Without Sharia, there is no Tariqa to walk, no Marifa to taste, no Haqiqa to reach. The 4 levels are not 4 separate roads you can choose between. They are one single road, and you must walk it in order, one step firmly placed after another. So let us begin then, at the beginning, with Sharia. What is Sharia? In the simplest terms, Sharia is the sacred law. It is the framework of worship and conduct that has been revealed. The 5 daily prayers, the fasting, the charity, the pilgrimage, the commands and the prohibitions, the halal and the haram. The entire structure of how a believer is meant to stand before God and how a believer is meant to walk through this world in relation to other people. It is easy, my friends, to hear the word law and feel a sense of restriction, a sense of heaviness, as though Sharia is a cage built to limit your freedom. But Abdul Qadir Jilani taught the exact opposite understanding, and I want you to really sit with this. He taught that Sharia is not a cage. Sharia is a riverbank. Think about a river, a powerful flowing river, full of life-giving water, water that can irrigate fields, water that can quench the thirst of an entire nation. Now imagine that river without banks. Without banks to contain it, that same water does not become more powerful. It does not become freer. It becomes a flood. It spreads out shallow and wild in every direction, and instead of nourishing the land, it drowns it. The banks of the river are not the enemy of the water. The banks are what give the water direction, what give it force, what allow it to travel from the mountain spring all the way to the distant sea and actually accomplish something along the way. Sharia is the river bank of the soul. It does not restrict your spiritual energy. It channels it. It gives your worship, your discipline, your yearning for God a direction so powerful that it can actually carry you somewhere, instead of leaving you scattered and shallow and going nowhere at all. Abdul Qadir Jilani himself was known, from his very earliest years, for an almost unbelievable devotion to this outer law. There are accounts from his youth, when he was still a boy in Gilan, of a level of scrupulous honesty and God consciousness that astonished the people around him. It is narrated that as a young boy traveling with a caravan toward Baghdad to seek knowledge, the caravan was attacked by highway robbers. The robbers went from traveler to traveler, taking their gold, their silver, their possessions. When they came to young Abdul Qadir, they asked him if he had anything of value, and he told them the truth. He said his mother had sewn a small number of gold coins into the lining of his garment for his journey. The robbers were stunned. "Why would you tell us this?" they asked, "when we would never have found it, when you could have simply kept quiet and kept your gold?" And his answer has echoed down through the centuries. He said that his mother had made him promise, before he left home, that he would never lie, under any circumstance, no matter what. And he told them that he valued that promise, that truthfulness, more than he valued the gold itself. The story goes that this honesty struck the hearts of the robbers so deeply that they repented right there on the road and abandoned their life of thievery entirely. My friends, this is Sharia lived out in its most beautiful form. It is not a technical checklist. It is character. It is integrity down to the very core of who you are, even when nobody is watching, even when lying would benefit you and truth would cost you everything you have. This is the foundation. And Abdul Qadir Jilani insisted, again and again throughout his teachings, that no matter how far a person travels on this journey, no matter what spiritual heights they believe they have reached, the obligations of Sharia never fall away. The prayers do not become optional. The lawful and unlawful do not become blurry matters of personal opinion. In fact, he taught that the closer a person draws to God, the more meticulous, the more careful, the more devoted they become to these outer practices, not less. Because the shell does not become unnecessary once the kernel begins to grow. The shell is what allows the kernel to grow safely in the first place. A tree does not outgrow its roots. The deeper the roots, the taller and stronger the tree can stand. Sharia is the root system of the entire spiritual journey. But Sharia alone, Jilani taught, is not the complete journey. It is possible, tragically possible, for a person to perform every outward practice with perfect precision and still have a heart that is hard, distracted, arrogant, or utterly disconnected from the reality of what they are doing. You can pray 5 times a day and still be spiritually asleep. You can fast every single day of the year and still be consumed by pride. Sharia gives you the correct shape, the correct structure, the correct outer form. But something more is needed to breathe life into that form, to move from merely performing the law to actually being transformed by it. And this is where the second level begins. This is Tariqa. Tariqa means the path, the way, the road that you walk once you have accepted the framework of the law, and now begin the inner work of actually applying it, refining yourself through it, disciplining the self through it. If Sharia is the map, Tariqa is the actual walking. If Sharia tells you where north is, Tariqa is the sweat on your back and the blisters on your feet as you march in that direction, day after day, year after year. This is the level of spiritual struggle. This is where the real difficulty of the journey begins. Because this is where you come face to face with your own nafs, your own lower self, your own ego, and you begin the long, uncomfortable, often painful process of disciplining it. Abdul Qadir Jilani spoke about the nafs with a clarity and a bluntness that still cuts through centuries of time and reaches directly into the heart of anyone who reads his words today. He taught that the nafs is like a wild, untrained animal living inside every one of us. Left completely unrestrained, it will demand pleasure, it will demand comfort, it will demand its own way. It will justify anger and greed and laziness and every kind of excuse imaginable. And it will do all of this while whispering to you that this is simply who you are, that this is just your nature, that you cannot help it. But Jilani taught that the nafs can be trained, exactly the way a wild horse can be trained, exactly the way a falcon can be tamed to return to the hand of its master. It takes patience. It takes repetition. It takes a willingness to say no to yourself over and over and over again, in small moments that nobody else will ever see, until eventually that discipline becomes second nature, until the wild animal becomes a loyal servant instead of a tyrant ruler. He described his own early years of spiritual training in the wilderness outside Baghdad, years of intense asceticism, of extreme hunger, of solitude, of confronting his own soul in the harshest conditions imaginable. He spoke of nights spent in the ruins and the desert, wrestling with temptation, wrestling with fear, wrestling with the voice inside him that told him to give up, to go home, to return to comfort. And through all of this, he taught his students something that I think is one of the most important lessons of the entire Tariqa level. He taught that spiritual struggle is not about punishing yourself out of hatred for yourself. It is about loving yourself enough, respecting the potential inside yourself enough, that you refuse to let the lower self keep you trapped in patterns that are beneath your true dignity as a human being created by God. The struggle of Tariqa is an act of love, not an act of cruelty. On this level, Jilani placed enormous importance on the role of a spiritual guide, a teacher, someone further along the path who could see the blind spots in a student that the student could never see in himself. He taught that trying to walk the path of Tariqa entirely alone, without any guidance, without any accountability, without anyone to correct your mistakes, is like trying to perform surgery on yourself. You simply cannot see your own back. You need someone standing behind you, someone with experience, someone who has already walked the road and knows exactly where the hidden pitfalls are buried. This is why he gathered students around him, why he built what became one of the great centers of spiritual education in Baghdad. Because he understood that the path of purification is walked far more safely, far more successfully, in community under guidance, than it is walked alone in isolated pride. And what does this purification actually look like in daily life? Jilani broke it down into practical, tangible disciplines. Patience in the face of hardship, instead of complaint and bitterness. Gratitude in the face of blessing, instead of taking everything for granted. Trust in God's provision, instead of anxious grasping and hoarding. Contentment with what has been given, instead of endless comparison with what others have. Sincerity in worship, doing things for the sake of God alone, instead of doing them to be seen and praised by other people. He taught that every single interaction in your ordinary day, every meal you eat, every conversation you have, every moment of frustration in traffic or in a difficult relationship, every single one of these ordinary moments is actually a training ground for the nafs. Tariqa is not something that only happens in a mosque or a quiet room of meditation. Tariqa happens in the grocery store when you are tempted to be short with the cashier. It happens in your home when you are tempted to raise your voice at someone you love. It happens in the marketplace when you are tempted to cut corners for a little extra profit. The path is walked in the middle of ordinary life, and every single test you face is an opportunity to either feed the wild nafs or to tame it a little further. Let me tell you something else about how Abdul Qadir Jilani framed this level, because I think it will help you tonight in a very practical way. He taught that the nafs generally moves through its own stages of maturity, the way a person moves through stages of physical growth. In its lowest state, the nafs is what is called the commanding self. The self that simply issues demands and expects to be obeyed instantly. The self that says, I want this now. I deserve this now. Give me comfort now. Regardless of consequence, regardless of harm to yourself or to others. Most people, if they are honest with themselves, spend a great deal of their lives being ruled by this commanding self without ever realizing it, mistaking its loud demands for their own true identity. Through the discipline of Tariqa, through the daily practice of resisting those demands, the nafs begins to mature into what is called the self-reproaching self. The self that still slips, still fails, still gives in sometimes to temptation, but that now feels a pang of conscience afterward, a moment of regret, a whisper that says, you know that was wrong, you know you can do better than that. This reproach, Jilani taught, is actually a sign of enormous spiritual progress, even though it feels uncomfortable, even though it feels like failure. A person who feels nothing after wrongdoing is far more spiritually endangered than a person who feels the sting of conscience and repents. That sting is the nafs waking up. And with enough patience, enough sincere repentance, enough consistent discipline over months and years, the fafs can mature further still into what is described as the tranquil self, the self that has become so accustomed to obedience, so at peace with submission to what is right, that virtue no longer feels like a battle. It feels like home. This is not a transformation that happens overnight, my friends, and Jilani never promised his students it would. He compared it to the slow carving of stone by water, imperceptible day by day, undeniable after years. He also taught something incredibly compassionate about the inevitable failures that happen along this road, and I think this is a message so many people desperately need to hear tonight. He did not teach that a single slip, a single relapse into old habits, a single moment of anger or weakness erases the progress that a person has made. He taught that the path of Tariqa is not a straight line marching steadily upward without interruption. It is more like the tide of the ocean, advancing and receding, advancing and receding. But with the overall waterline slowly, steadily rising over time, if the person does not give up entirely. What matters, he insisted, is not whether you fall. Every single human being who has ever walked this earth, apart from the prophets themselves, has fallen at some point. What matters is whether you rise again afterward, whether you dust yourself off, whether you return to the discipline with humility, instead of abandoning the entire journey out of despair or shame. He used to remind his students that despair itself, giving up on the possibility of your own spiritual growth, is a far greater danger to the soul than any single sin, because despair closes the door entirely, while a sin followed by sincere return leaves the door wide open. As a person continues walking this path, continues this daily discipline, continues submitting the ego to correction again and again, falling and rising, something begins to shift inside them. The heart, which was once clouded with distraction and self-interest, begins to become clear, like water that has been left to settle until the mud sinks to the bottom and the water above becomes transparent. And through that clarity, a new kind of perception begins to open up. This is the beginning of the third level. This is marifa. Marifa is often translated simply as gnosis, or spiritual knowledge, but I want to be very precise here, because this word means something very specific and very different from ordinary knowledge. Ordinary knowledge, the kind you learn in school, the kind you read in books, is knowledge that stays outside of you. You can know a fact about fire, that it is hot, that it burns, without ever having touched it. But marifa is not that kind of knowledge. Marifa is the knowledge of experience. It is the difference between reading a book about the taste of honey and actually placing honey on your tongue. Abdul Qadir Jilani taught that at this level of the journey, a person moves beyond simply believing in God as an intellectual concept, beyond simply performing worship as an obligation, and begins to actually taste, to actually experience, a direct and living awareness of God's presence, God's attributes, God's nearness, in a way that transforms the entire inner landscape of the heart. This is an incredibly delicate stage to describe, my friends, because words themselves begin to fail here. How do you describe a taste to someone who has never tasted it? How do you describe color to someone who has never seen? Jilani, like the great masters before and after him, often relied on paradox and metaphor to point toward what cannot be directly spoken. He taught that at the level of marifa, the heart becomes like a polished mirror. When a mirror is covered in dust and grime, it cannot reflect anything clearly, no matter how bright the light shining upon it. But as the mirror is polished, through the discipline of Tariqa, through the years of struggle against the nafs, through sincere worship, through remembrance of God, that dust begins to be wiped away. And as the mirror becomes clean, it begins to reflect the light that was always shining upon it, a light that was there the entire time, but which the dust had been preventing the heart from perceiving. He taught that this level brings with it a profound and often overwhelming sense of humility. This might surprise you. You would think that reaching a higher spiritual level would bring pride, a sense of achievement, a sense of having arrived at something great. But Jilani taught the exact opposite. The closer a person actually comes to real spiritual knowledge, the smaller they feel, the more aware they become of how vast God's reality actually is, and how little they truly understand or deserve. He warned very strongly against people who claimed states of marifa, while displaying arrogance, superiority, or contempt for ordinary people. He said that true spiritual knowledge softens a person. It makes them more compassionate, more humble, more gentle with the struggles of others, because they begin to see with real clarity how much mercy it has taken to bring even themselves this far along the path. At this stage, Jilani also taught something that I find incredibly beautiful and incredibly relevant to how we treat one another in daily life. He taught that a person who has tasted real marifa begins to see the signs of God everywhere, in the smallest things, in the structure of a leaf, in the cry of a newborn child, in the vastness of the night sky, in the kindness of a stranger. The entire universe becomes what he described as a book of signs, and the person who has reached marifa begins to read that book fluently, where before they could only see disconnected, meaningless letters. Nothing in creation is ordinary to them anymore. Every single thing becomes evidence, becomes a pointer, becomes a reminder. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think there is a very common misunderstanding about marifa that needs to be cleared up, especially for those of us living in the modern world, surrounded by noise, surrounded by distraction, surrounded by a culture that constantly tells us that meaning must be dramatic, must be visible, must be something we can photograph and share and prove to other people. Abdul Qadir Jilani taught that marifa very rarely announces itself with fireworks. It does not usually arrive as some overwhelming thunderous vision that knocks a person off their feet in front of witnesses. Far more often, he taught, it arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary night, in the stillness after the dawn prayer, in a single unexpected tear that falls while reading a verse you have read 100 times before, in a sudden and inexplicable wave of love for God that rises up in your chest while you are doing something as mundane as washing dishes or walking down a quiet street. He warned his students not to dismiss these small, quiet moments as insignificant simply because they were not dramatic. He taught that the greatest spiritual realities in a person's life often arrive exactly like a seed arrives, small, silent, and easy to overlook, and yet capable, given enough time and enough care, of growing into something that eventually shades an entire life. He also taught his students to be deeply suspicious of anyone who used claims of spiritual knowledge to elevate themselves above others, to demand special treatment, or to excuse bad character. This was one of his sharpest and most repeated warnings, because in his own time, just as in ours, there were people who wrapped themselves in the language of spirituality while behaving with cruelty, arrogance, and dishonesty underneath that language. Jilani taught his students a very simple test, a test that I believe is just as useful today as it was 900 years ago. He said, look at the fruit, not at the claim. A tree is known by what it produces, not by what it says about itself. If a person claims great spiritual knowledge, great closeness to God, great mystical insight, but their character remains harsh, their treatment of the weak remains cruel, their honesty remains questionable, then their claim is empty, no matter how beautifully it is dressed in spiritual language. But if a person grows daily in humility, in patience, in generosity, in mercy toward every living creature around them, then real marifa is at work in them, whether they ever use that word to describe themselves or not. And it is from this deep well of experiential knowledge, this direct tasting of spiritual reality, refined further by humility and tested by the simple honesty of good character, that a person is finally, by the grace of God and never purely by their own effort alone, brought to the fourth and final level. This is Haqiqa. Haqiqa means the ultimate reality, the absolute truth. This is the oil at the very heart of the almond, the pure essence that was always there, hidden beneath the shell and the skin and the kernel, waiting patiently to be reached. At this level, Abdul Qadir Jilani taught that the seeker comes to a profound and overwhelming realization of the singular, ultimate reality of God, a realization so complete that it reorganizes everything the person previously understood about existence itself. This is the level often described using the term fana, the annihilation or the effacement of the self. Not that the person literally ceases to exist, but that the illusion of the self as an independent, self-sufficient, separate center of the universe dissolves, and what remains is an overwhelming awareness of dependence upon and connection to the one true reality that sustains everything that exists. I want to be very careful here, my friends, because this is exactly the level where, throughout history, some people have gone astray, mistaking a profound spiritual experience for a license to abandon the very foundation that carried them there in the first place. Abdul Qadir Jilani was famously fiercely protective of orthodoxy on this exact point. He insisted that even at the level of Haqiqa, even at the peak of spiritual realization, a person remains fully bound by the law, fully a servant, fully obligated to prayer and fasting and honesty and kindness, and every single command that governs a righteous life, In fact, he taught that the deepest truth a person can realize at the level of Haqiqa is precisely how essential Sharia has been the entire time. The journey does not end with the shell being discarded as useless. The journey ends with the seeker understanding, at the deepest possible level, exactly why the shell was there, exactly how much protection and structure it provided, exactly how the whole beautiful architecture of shell, skin, kernel, and oil was never four separate things at all, but one single almond, one single truth, expressing itself at different depths. He used to teach his students that the four levels are like four rooms in a single house, and Haqiqa is not a room that exists somewhere outside the house. It is the deepest room, the innermost chamber, but you can only reach it by walking through every other room first. And once you are standing in that innermost chamber, you can look back and see the entire house, all four rooms, all as part of a single unified structure, all necessary, all connected, none of them optional, none of them separate from the others. There is a story told about Abdul Qadir Jilani that I think illustrates this final level more powerfully than any abstract explanation ever could. It is said that later in his life, while he sat in seclusion deep in his spiritual struggle, a great light appeared before him, filling the sky, and a voice spoke to him, declaring, "O Abdul Qadir, I am your Lord, and I have made unlawful things lawful for you because of your high station." Any ordinary seeker, especially one who had convinced himself he had reached the peak of spiritual attainment, might have been swept away by such an experience, might have accepted such a declaration with pride and relief, believing he had finally been released from the burden of the law. But Abdul Qadir Jilani, grounded so deeply in the foundation of Sharia, grounded so completely in the knowledge that the law of God can never contradict the essence of God, immediately recognized this as a test and a deception. He responded firmly, "Begone, enemy of God, for what you speak contradicts the very law of my Lord." And in that instant, the light vanished, and it dissolved into darkness and smoke, and the voice that had claimed divinity confessed that it had been a trial sent to test the sincerity of his knowledge, a trial that countless other travelers on this path had failed before him, mistaking a beautiful deception for the ultimate truth simply because it felt overwhelming, felt powerful, felt like exactly the confirmation their ego had been secretly hoping for. When his students later asked him how he had known, so instantly and with such certainty, that the voice was false, his answer became one of the most treasured lessons in the entire tradition. He said that he recognized the falsehood specifically because of the words themselves, because he knew, with the certainty planted in him through years of walking the path of Sharia first, that the law of God does not simply bend itself to reward a person's spiritual rank, that no amount of closeness to God ever grants a human being permission to abandon what has been made clearly unlawful. This, my friends, is Haqiqa in its truest and safest form. Not a truth that erases the law, but a truth so deeply integrated into the seeker that it becomes an unshakable internal compass, capable of detecting falsehood the instant it appears, no matter how radiant, no matter how convincing, no matter how much it flatters the traveler's sense of spiritual achievement. The seeker who has truly reached Haqiqa is not the one who feels free from obligation. He is the one who has become so united with the truth that obligation and love are no longer two separate things pulling him in different directions, but a single unified reality flowing through the same heart. This, my friends, is why Abdul Qadir Jilani remains one of the most balanced, most trusted, most universally respected spiritual teachers in all of history. He never allowed the mystical heights of Haqiqa to become an excuse for abandoning the discipline of Sharia. He never allowed the discipline of Sharia to become dry, lifeless legalism disconnected from the heart. He held both together, the outer and the inner, the law and the love, the structure and the ecstasy, in perfect balance, and he insisted that anyone who tried to have one without the other was walking a broken and dangerous path. Now let me bring all of this back to you, sitting here tonight, in your ordinary life, with your ordinary struggles and your ordinary responsibilities. Why does any of this matter to you? Let me tell you why. Because every single one of us is at some point on this journey right now, whether we have ever thought about it in these terms or not. Perhaps you are still standing at the level of Sharia, still learning the basic structure, still building the habit of prayer, still working on simple honesty and simple discipline. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is the foundation, and there is no shame in laying a strong foundation. Perhaps you are deep in the struggle of Tariqa right now, wrestling with your own nafs, fighting against anger or laziness or pride or bad habits that you cannot seem to shake, feeling exhausted by the daily discipline required to keep walking. I want you to know that this exhaustion is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you are actually on the path, actually doing the work, actually walking instead of standing still. Perhaps, by the mercy of God, you have tasted moments of marifa, moments where the world suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. Moments of overwhelming gratitude or overwhelming awe that seem to come from nowhere and disappear just as quickly, leaving you longing for more. Treasure those moments. They are glimpses, given to encourage you to keep walking deeper into the path. And wherever you are on this journey tonight, I want you to hear this clearly. The path is not a competition. It is not a race against the people sitting around you. Abdul Qadir Jilani never taught his students to compare their spiritual progress with one another, to boast about how far along they had come, to look down on those still struggling with the basics. He taught humility at every single level, from the very first step of Shariah to the very final depths of Haqiqa. The only comparison that matters is the comparison between who you were yesterday and who you're becoming today, one small act of discipline at a time, one prayer at a time, one moment of patience at a time, one small victory over your own nafs at a time. I also want you to hear something else, something that I think gets lost far too often when people discuss spirituality at this level of depth. This is not meant to be a burden that crushes you. Abdul Qadir Jilani was not a harsh man. Those who knew him, those who sat in his gatherings, described a man of extraordinary warmth, extraordinary generosity. A man who wept easily out of love for God and out of compassion for struggling people. A man who fed the poor with his own hands, who forgave those who wronged him, who treated the lowest servant in his household with the same dignity he showed to the wealthiest visitor who came to seek his counsel. The 4 levels of truth are not a punishment. They are an invitation. They are a gift. They are the roadmap that has been laid out in mercy for anyone who is tired of chasing shadows and finally ready to search for what is real. So what do you do, practically, tonight, when you leave this place and go back to your ordinary life? You begin exactly where you are. If your prayers have been inconsistent, you make them consistent. That is Shariah, and it is never too late to strengthen that foundation. If you know there is a habit inside you, a piece of your nafs that has been running wild unchecked for far too long, you begin today in some small way to discipline it. That is Tariqa, and it does not require dramatic gestures. It requires small, repeated, faithful acts of resistance against your own lower impulses. You seek out people wiser than you, people further along the path, and you learn from them with humility instead of trying to walk this entire journey in isolated pride. And you watch patiently, faithfully for those glimpses of marifa, those moments when the veil grows thin, when gratitude overwhelms you, when the ordinary world suddenly shimmers with meaning you cannot fully explain. And when those moments come, you do not chase after them frantically. You simply thank God for them, and you keep walking, because the destination, Haqiqa itself, is not something you can force or manufacture through your own effort alone. It is a gift given at the end of a road walked in sincerity, patience, and love. Let me speak to you for a moment about time, because I think this is where so many sincere people lose heart on this journey. We live in an age of instant results. We expect a message to arrive the second we send it, an answer to appear the second we search for it, a package to reach our door within a day of ordering it. And so, when we turn toward the spiritual path, some hidden part of us secretly expects transformation to work the same way, expects that if we pray with focus tonight, we should feel enlightened by tomorrow morning, expects that a few weeks of discipline should produce the tranquil heart of a lifelong saint. Abdul Qadir Jilani lived in a different rhythm entirely, and he taught his students to live in that different rhythm too. He spent decades, not days, wandering the wilderness, submitting himself to discipline before he ever stood in Baghdad teaching thousands. His own teacher poured years of correction into him before pronouncing him ready. And even then, Jilani himself would tell his students that the path never truly ends in this life, that a person is always walking, always refining, always in need of returning to God in humility, no matter how many years they have already walked. If you take nothing else from tonight, I want you to take this. Do not measure your progress in days or weeks. Measure it in years, and measure it against your former self, and be patient with the process the way a farmer is patient with a seed he cannot dig up every morning to check on its roots without killing it. I also want to speak to those of you tonight who feel that you have wasted years, who feel that you started down this road once, with great enthusiasm and then drifted away from it, distracted by the world, weighed down by hardship, or simply worn out by the difficulty of staying consistent. Abdul Qadir Jilani had deep compassion for exactly this kind of struggle, because he understood human weakness intimately, not as an outside observer looking down on it, but as someone who had wrestled with his own nafs in the harshest conditions imaginable. He taught that the door back to this path is never sealed shut. There is no expiration date on sincerity. A person who returns to prayer after 10 years of neglect is not starting from some permanently diminished position. They are simply beginning again, exactly where they now stand, and every single step forward from this moment matters just as much as it would have mattered a decade ago. The only truly wasted time on this path is the time spent in despair, believing that return is no longer possible. As long as breath remains in your body, the door of Shariah, the road of Tariqa, the wells of Marifa, and the horizon of Haqiqa all remain open to you, waiting exactly as patient as they have always been. There is one more teaching I want to leave with you before we close tonight, because I believe it ties everything we have discussed into a single thread that you can carry home with you and hold on to in the middle of your ordinary week. Abdul Qadir Jilani taught that the entire purpose of this four-level journey is not simply personal transformation for its own sake, not simply so that you as an individual can feel more peaceful or more enlightened while the rest of the world continues to suffer around you. He taught that a heart truly transformed by this path becomes, almost automatically, a source of mercy for everyone around it. The scholar who has walked through Shariah into Tariqa, through Tariqa into Marifa, through Marifa into Haqiqa, does not end this journey isolated on some distant mountaintop, disconnected from ordinary people. He becomes instead more deeply engaged with ordinary people than ever before, more patient with their weaknesses, more generous with their needs, more forgiving of their failures, precisely because he now understands, from the inside, exactly how difficult this journey is, exactly how much mercy it has taken to bring him this far himself. Jilani's own life was proof of this. He was famous not for withdrawing from society into cold isolation, but for feeding thousands of the poor with his own resources, for opening his gatherings to scholars and beggars alike, for treating the powerful and the powerless with the exact same dignity and warmth. The final fruit of Haqiqa, he taught, is not distance from creation. It is a deeper, wider, more selfless love for creation than the seeker ever possessed before beginning the journey. Abdul Qadir Jilani spent his entire life teaching, guiding, correcting, and loving thousands of students who came to him from every direction. And nearly 1,000 years later, his words are still being read, still being taught, still changing lives. Because he touched something universal, something that exists inside every human heart, regardless of language or culture or century. He touched the ancient, unshakable human longing for truth. Real truth, not the comfortable illusions we build to distract ourselves, but the actual, solid, eternal reality that our souls were created to seek in the first place. My dear friends, the four levels are waiting for every single one of us. Shariah is the shell that protects you. Tariqa is the path that refines you. Marifa is the knowledge that awakens you. And Haqiqa is the truth that finally completely sets you free, not free from responsibility, not free from discipline, but free from the illusions that have kept your heart clouded and distracted for far too long. The almond is sitting in your hand tonight. The shell is there. The skin is there. The kernel and the oil are waiting inside, exactly where they have always been, patient, hidden, real. All that is required of you is the willingness to begin, and to keep walking, one honest step at a time, for as long as it takes, until you finally reach the truth that was waiting for you from the very beginning. Think, for just one more moment, about where you will be tomorrow morning. The sun will rise, exactly as it always does, indifferent to whether you decide tonight to take this journey seriously, or to let these words fade away by the time you fall asleep. The choice in front of you is not a choice between an ordinary life and some impossible dramatic transformation reserved only for saints and scholars of the past. The choice in front of you is far smaller and far more achievable than that. It is simply the choice to take one honest step tomorrow that you were not planning to take before tonight. Perhaps that step is a prayer prayed on time instead of delayed. Perhaps it is a single moment of patience held instead of anger released. Perhaps it is a small act of charity given quietly, without anyone ever knowing it was you. Abdul Qadir Jilani did not become the Ghawth al-Azam in a single leap. He became who he was, one obedient step at a time, repeated with sincerity across an entire lifetime. And that is the exact same road that lies open in front of every person listening to these words tonight. So let this be more than a speech that you heard once and then set aside. Let it be a beginning. Let it be the almond placed firmly in your hand, waiting to be opened. Shariah is calling you to build the foundation, honestly and without excuse. Tariqa is calling you to walk, patiently and without despair, through the daily discipline of taming your own soul. Marifa is calling you to open your eyes to the signs that surround you in every direction, in every ordinary moment of your ordinary day. And Haqiqa is calling you toward the truth that has been waiting for you since before you were even born. The truth that gives every other truth in this world its meaning. May every one of us find the courage to take that first step tonight, and the patience to keep walking until we arrive.